All right, can you hear me? Hi, comrades. All right, just to start with, to introduce this talk as a question, why? Why are we doing this talk at this time? We're talking about an organization that was formed over 100 years ago. However, the lessons are very important still. And that is because Zionism has presented Jewish people as a monolith united behind Israel and as the political expression of Jewishness. And that is especially true in the context that we see today of the war on the people of Gaza, war of genocide on the people of Gaza, I should add. Thus, criticism of Israel has become criticism of Jewishness as put forward by an organization that does not represent us all, for sure, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. But what we have seen is a revival of organizations in the Jewish community that are opposed to that definition of Jewishness, particularly when I belong to the Independent Jewish Voices, but also a revival of another reputable organization called United Jewish People's Order, and Jewish Voice for Peace in the States, Not in My Name, et cetera, et cetera. I think comrades know who they are. And it's most important in this talk, I just want to locate this talk in saying that this is not outside the Jewish tradition, but actually the Jewish Bund is part of it, and that revival is related to that radical wave that took place in the last century, at the beginning of the last century and before, actually. So first of all, to do very quick history here of where were Jews, European Jews. In the Middle Ages, Poland was seen as the most liberal of European countries, surprise, surprise. And it became the country with the largest Jewish population as a result, due to the expulsion of Jews from other countries. So 3/4 of European Jews lived in Poland. In the early 19th century, Poland was, there was a partition of Poland by Russia and the Habsburgs. And that meant that most Jews living in the east part of Poland actually became part of the Russian Empire at that point. So think of that Jewish population in Poland becoming part of the Russian Empire. The Pale of Settlement, P-A-L-E of settlement, the Jewish Pale, was formed by the Russian Tsar Nicholas I. It was in order to de-Judaize Russia, to remove Jews from Russia. And the Pale covered a large section of the portion of the western part of the Russian Empire, including large portions of what is now Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Belarus. The language of the Pale was Yiddish. The Russian was spoken by the upper class Jews. Not all Jews lived in the Pale, but the vast majority of it was. And since its formation in the earlier part of the 19th century, it was continually being reduced in size. Jews were restricted from practicing agriculture by the Tsarist government, both because the Jewish Pale was small, but also it provided competition against the Russian peasantry, and therefore it was popular to restrict Jews in their competition. And Jews who did venture outside or lived outside the Pale were not allowed to touch machines. And you can see Jewish life was very, very restricted to the Pale. It was restricted outside. The vast majority of Jews were not allowed into higher education. And therefore, I'll just say that there's a stereotype of Jews as artisans and traders, and particularly moneylenders. I know you've heard of that. And this is where it comes from. There's a real historical root to Jews being forced into those corners, if you will, of occupation. Frequent pogroms were a reality of Jewish life. So they could last for days. And that meant that Christian populations, police, soldiers would enter the Pale, would enter Jewish villages or shtetls, and they were egged on by the Tsar's media, and they were beating and killing at random. And at the same time as that was happening in the Jewish Pale, with the attacks on Jews, there was with the concentration of Jews in the Pale, they built their own form of workshops. There was a rapid construction of workshops towards the end of the 19th century, and really representing an early form of industrialization that took place inside the Pale, making it one of the most advanced parts of the Russian Empire. Very interesting in terms of the birth of the Bund. So Jews were at once forced to defend themselves against the anti-Semitic Tsar and the Russian Empire and those who would attack them. And they were also being proletarianized at the same time. They worked in those workshops. They were exclusive Jewish workshops, and they were confronting their own bosses, other Jews in the workshops. And just moving on to the birth of the Bund, the Jewish Bund, or the General Jewish Workers Bund is what the formal name is. We're calling it the Bund. Those Jews, so as this was happening, the workshops were growing, industrialization was growing. Those Jews were able to have education, came back to the Pale, and they came back with the ideas of Karl Marx. And this is how the Bund began to grow. They built the Bund by talking to Jewish workers. Not in Yiddish. They didn't speak Yiddish. They spoke Russian. Remember, the upper classes spoke Russian, but they learned Yiddish, and they brought those politics. And the Bund itself was therefore formed in 1897 by Jewish workers. And interestingly enough, that date is the same year of the formation of the Zionist movement by Theodor Herzl. A very, very different Jewish movement, as we'll elaborate on. The Bund saw the main contradiction in society as the antagonism between Jewish workers and their bosses, completely different from that of the Zionists, who saw workers and bosses having their interests in common. And of course, we can discuss this. The roots of this Zionist movement came from the upper classes and those who wished to assimilate with Christians, etc. One of the most important concepts of the Bund was Doigkeit. Hard to pronounce, but think of this. Here-ness is what it means. Here-ness is so important to the revolutionary tradition. It rejected Zionism and the move to a so-called Jewish state, or a Jewish patch of territory where all Jews could be, and said, the struggle is where we are. It's here-ness. The struggle is here where Jews are now. And the struggle is against our own, but the Jewish upper classes. So important for us today to think about as Marxists. And the Bund saw itself as a Jewish wing of a part of a nascent revolutionary workers movement. And in Russia, the actual party, the Revolutionary Party, was born in 1898, which is the RSDLP, the Russian Social Democratic and Labor Party. A third of its members were Jewish. It had a very prominent position in leadership of the leadership. And the RSDLP adopted many of the practices of the Bund. And I think this is important too, and this is a credit to the Bund, a model of an interventionist revolutionary party. What we seek to be in the IS, this came from the Bund. It's the idea that the party intervened in the class and as a leading edge of the class. The workers' press, professional revolutionaries, as Lenin called them, people who were dedicated to building revolutionary practice. And all right, at the end of the 1903 Congress of the RSDLP, which I'm moving right up to, there was a split between the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks, and I won't go into that. Maybe we can go into that in discussion, because that's another issue. But there was a split in which the Bund participated in a major way. What the Bund said at that time was that there needed to be a separate organization of Jewish workers within the RSDLP. And it was modeled on the Austrian Federation of different nationalities as a party bringing together sections. And Lenin argued against this, and he said the Bund A could not be the sole representative of Jewish workers. There were Jewish workers in the RSDLP outside of the Bund. But he also argued that the whole party, RSDLP at this point, and later the Bolshevik Party, which came out of that split, had to take on the issue of Jewish oppression. And that's the beginning of our approach as revolutionary socialists to the issue of oppression. And that's a big issue of separate organization. I know in Peterborough we've had that discussion in the last few months. And that the fight against exploitation could not be fought without the fight against oppression, and that the overthrow of capitalism necessitated maximum unity within the class, whether it's Jew, non-Jew, women, men, gay, straight, Muslims as part of the Russian Empire, etc. Everybody had to be brought in together, and the oppression had to be addressed as well as the exploitation. All right, moving right up to 1905. So 1905 was a time of revolution in Russia because Russia was defeated in a war with Japan, and this often leads to a lot of stirring in the working class, where soldiers came back demanding reforms. And without going into any detail, they were led by a priest, they made demands for reforms, they were attacked, and the revolution broke out. And what's important, not to go into detail about that, but the Bund plays a really important part. So despite having major differences with the Bolsheviks, who played a crucial part in 1905 and leading it, the Bund also played a crucial part, despite their differences with Lenin and the Bolsheviks and well, to some extent, Trotsky. 1905 revolt was defeated. And a bloody defeat by the Tsar, and the lead up to World War II was a very difficult time for both Jewish revolutionaries and revolutionaries everywhere. As a result of World War I, as a result of World War I, the Pale and thus the Bund was split in two. So you saw, as a result of the war, Poland was split, or there was a Polish section and a Russian section, and it was right down in the middle of where the Pale were and the Jewish population was. So for the first time, you have a Bund that wasn't just solely in Russia, it was also in Poland. And you had a separate development of the Polish Bund, in that it began to focus on Jewish cultural organizations, sports clubs, schools, etc. In Russia, a very different development, because your revolution was taking place in 1917 in Russia. And many of members of the Russian Bund, again, despite their differences with leading Bolsheviks like Lenin, found themselves in the leadership of the revolution. And the Bolsheviks attracted many Bundists into their rank, partly because, going back to that fight against oppression, the Bolsheviks made themselves the best fighters against anti-Semitism, and therefore many who had said we needed separate organizations said all of a sudden, no, we're going to fight with the Bolsheviks, and they represent us. And this was particularly the case in Ukraine, where life was particularly hard for Jews, and they joined the Communist Bund or Kombund, leading to the dissolution of the Russian section of the Bund. In Poland, many members of the Bund, even though the different direction was taken by the Bund there, joined the Kombund, and eventually in 1922, the Polish Communist Party, particularly in the industrial sections of Lodz and Białystok, where there were many Jewish textile workers. After the defeat of the revolutionary wave in 1917 to 1919, the Bund in Poland turned towards election work, and it experienced major success. It won many elections in the Jewish community against the Zionists. So the Bund was always seen as the majority representative of Jews in Poland, and not the Zionists. And I think this is important for today. The Bund did not join the Comintern. However, they joined what was called the Second and a Half International. They did not join the Social Democratic Socialist International either, because they continued to consider themselves revolutionary, but they insisted on some kind of separate organization. And that's why they joined an international, without going into great detail, that was somewhere between social democracy and revolutionary socialism. World War II, 1930 Stalinist Russia decimated the leadership of the Bolsheviks, and therefore many Jews were murdered in the Stalinist purges and put on trial in the 30s. And in Poland, the Bund saw what was coming from the West. In Germany, they joined with the Polish Socialist Party, the trade union movement, in building resistance to fascism, and the Polish Communist Party also, sorry. And they abandoned the idea of working separately as they were doing in Poland, and they worked with other trade unionists. There was very brave resistance to the Nazis, especially the Warsaw Ghetto. I won't go into any detail. Marek Edelman writes a beautiful book. I think we carry it, called The Ghetto Fights. Wonderful, wonderful story of bravery of the Jewish Bund and the socialist fighters, Jewish fighters. Almost done here. The Bund, therefore, after World War II, stopped being a major force in the Jewish community because there was very little of it left in Poland. Poland still held most Jews in Europe, even after the split with Russia in terms of World War I, and they were decimated in a terrible way. However, those who gathered as part of the Bund continued, while they accepted after World War II the necessity of the Jewish state because of the Holocaust and the horrible conditions, they continued to question its establishment on Palestinian land. Now, unfortunately, moving on up to the creation of Israel, you had a section of the Zionist movement which was called the left. While Zion was what it's called, and it sort of brought the ideas of that class struggle between Jewish worker and Jewish boss into the Zionist movement. We're going to take it to Israel, to Palestinian lands. And in fact, in some ways, that was the model of the kibbutzim and labor Zionism, which is completely gone now. David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, based himself on that. And I would say that has very little to do representation within Zionism anymore. And finally, the legacy of the Bund, and I'll finish on this. The Jewish General Labor Bund was born out of class struggle, and this is crucially important. And it was born out of the differing interests between Jews. Never did it ever say that Jews had similar interests as you hear now. Never. It opposed that. And it said our main struggle is with other Jews. Those are the capitalist class. So that's crucially important. And we need to hear that. It emphasized proletarian internationalism. It saw itself part of an international movement of working class people, and it saw itself as a force to overthrow the capitalist system. Its weakness, as I detailed, was its insistence on separate organization, even though it threw itself into the struggle in 1905, again in 1917. There was still that wing or that ambivalence about how we represent Jews, possibly separately from the Revolutionary Party. We can discuss that. And Lenin said, you're mirroring the divisions brought upon us by capitalism, and we must build the fight against exploitation and oppression together. And I'll just ending on this. For us today, the Bund is a living, breathing tradition of Jewish radicalism, for young Jews especially, and for all those who stand in solidarity with a free Palestine, to point to and against the suffocating Zionist monolith that the upper classes wish to impose on us today. Thank you, comrades.